In a crowded gym where sweat and ambition filled the air, a quiet figure moved unnoticed, tall, composed, a black man whose presence barely stirred a whisper among the sea of eager fighters. He wasn't there to compete or teach, just to do a job others overlooked, carrying the weight of invisible burdens heavier than any opponent in the ring. Yet beneath his calm exterior lay a past so powerful it threatened to shatter every assumption the room held about strength, respect, and identity. What happens when the man who everyone underestimates steps onto the mat and changes the game forever? Stay with us as we unravel this gripping story of pride, prejudice, and redemption. If you're ready for a journey that challenges everything you think you know, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? And how does this story speak to you? Caleb Brooks looked like the kind of man who had quietly seen more than he ever said. At 46 years old, with deep bronze skin and streaks of gray crawling through his short-cropped hair, he wore his age not with weakness, but with quiet precision. He wasn't broad like the heavyweight fighters who trained at Iron Pulse MMA gym, but he had the wiry, efficient frame of someone built for movement, not show. His uniform was standard, navy blue pants, boots polished out of habit, a security patch stitched across the front of his vest. He wore a black cap pulled low over his brow, shading his smoke gray eyes that seemed to scan everything and nothing all at once. Each night, when the last classes ended and the fighters filtered out, Caleb remained silent, unnoticed, and absolutely consistent. His post was the front alcove, just past the double glass doors. From there, he had a clear view of the reception desk, the mat, and most of the training area. On slow nights, he sipped coffee from a battered thermos and listened to the faint static hum of the radio clipped to his shoulder. Most nights, no one spoke to him, and he was fine with that. He wasn't here to be known. He was here to keep the peace. That's how it had been for the past year, and how he intended to keep it. But that night, the last Thursday of September, the rhythm broke. Coach Rick Landon had decided to extend the final session, advanced striking drills, for 30 extra minutes. The air inside the gym was thick with sweat and friction, the sharp slaps of gloves against pads echoing off the steel beams. Rick's voice carried across the floor like a drumbeat. Reset. Jab, cross, hook, slip again. Caleb watched quietly from a stool, not staring, not interfering, just watching. That was when Rick's tone changed. "Hey," he called out loud and playful. "Security guy, you ever actually throw a punch or just guard the front door all day?" A couple students chuckled. Others looked up, confused. Caleb didn't move. "You talking to me?" he asked, voice low and neutral. Rick smiled wide. "Yeah, man. Come on. I see you over there every night, sitting in your little throne. Thought maybe you'd like to step up for a live demo. Give the kids a show." More laughter now. Uneven. A few nervous glances. Caleb remained seated. "I'm just doing my job, coach." Rick stepped off the mat and waved his hands dramatically toward the students, who instinctively formed a loose circle around him. "Ladies and gents, we got ourselves a humble man. But come on, let's be honest. You've watched us. You ever wonder if you could hang in a cage?" Caleb set his thermos down and rose slowly, not aggressively, just standing. And for a split second, the room dipped into a hush. Something in the way he moved, controlled, balanced, unhurried, wasn't quite what they expected. "We close in 15 minutes, he said. Rick grinned wider. "Plenty of time. One round. No hard hits. Just a little lesson for the young bloods." One of the students, a petite Korean-American woman with a purple belt and a notebook stuffed inside her gear bag, shifted uncomfortably. Her name was Angela. She had been documenting the gym's culture for her grad thesis in sports psychology. Something about this didn't sit right with her. Caleb's gaze swept the students. Most were under 30, eager, impressionable, wide-eyed. They were here to learn discipline, but tonight they were watching a show. "All right," Caleb said finally. His voice was calm. "But when it's done, you apologize. To them, not to me." Rick blinked, caught off guard by the quiet confidence. "You got it. I'll apologize to the floor for you face-planting on it." Caleb walked onto the mat, boots still on. Rick raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The students were silent now, watching closely. Caleb didn't raise his hands, didn't square up. He just stood there, relaxed, waiting. "Don't worry," Rick said, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. "I'll keep clean. Wouldn't want to mess up your retirement plan." Caleb said nothing. Angela frowned. There was something wrong here. The way Caleb stood, it wasn't awkward. It was intentional. Weight evenly distributed, chin tucked, eyes steady. Not a bouncer's stance, not a beginner's guess. It was something else, something old. Rick stepped forward, circling slightly, still talking for the crowd. "Ever seen a real fighter move? Folks, watch this." He made a show of loosening his shoulders, exhaling dramatically. Then he faked a quick step forward, just enough to draw a flinch. But Caleb didn't move, not even an inch. His eyes stayed locked on Rick's chest, unmoving. And that was the first moment Rick hesitated. Barely perceptible. A pause between inhale and action. But it was there. Angela noticed. So did another student, who shifted their stance subconsciously, as if sensing something was off balance in the air. Rick tried to laugh it off. His hands were up, his chin slightly raised, his breath sharp and rhythmic as he shadowboxed in place with deliberate flair. "Ladies and gents, this is what happens when you let the help get too comfortable," Rick called out, his voice loud and theatrical, drawing a few more uneasy chuckles from a group. One or two of the students looked away, clearly uncomfortable now that the tension was no longer funny, but starting to crackle with something sharper. Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than Rick's taunts. Rick continued anyway, circling like a wolf too full of himself to notice the direction of the wind had changed. This guy watches from his stool every night, sipping coffee and pretending he's not jealous of real fighters. But deep down, I bet he's always wondered what it feels like to stand on this mat, to throw down, to matter. The words echoed, but they didn't land the way Rick expected. The students weren't laughing anymore. Angela, standing near the back of the group, crossed her arms tightly. Her brow was furrowed, her mouth pressed into a thin line. Something in the air felt wrong, unsteady, like a scale tipping before the weight is even fully applied. Rick kept talking, unable to stop himself, drunk on the attention he mistook for admiration. "Don't worry," he said, addressing Caleb directly now. "I won't hit you hard. I mean, you've probably never even been in a ring, right? What's the most action you've seen? Drunk guys outside a bar yelling about parking spots." He mimicked a clumsy swing with exaggerated flair. A few chuckles came, weak and hollow. Caleb still didn't move. He didn't blink. Rick's grin faltered just slightly, but he doubled down. He couldn't stop now. "Come on, man, at least get into a stance," he said, half laughing. "Show us how you defend yourself from, I don't know, a mosquito." He gestured to the students. "This, folks, is what untrained looks like." He dropped into a low stance, fists up, weight shifting like he was about to spring. "You ready, Pops?" Caleb finally spoke, his voice even and deliberate. "You don't want to do this, son." The words weren't loud, but they stopped the room cold. Rick blinked. "Excuse me." Caleb didn't repeat himself. He didn't have to. There was something in the way he stood, the way he spoke, that carried weight, real weight, not the kind that comes from rank or trophies, but from something older and more dangerous. Rick laughed again, but it was different now, tighter, higher in pitch, like a man bluffing in a game he suddenly wasn't sure he wanted to play. "All right then," he said, raising his fists again. "Let's give the people what they came to see." He stepped in quick, a faint jab to the left, then a half-speed cross. Nothing heavy, just enough to test Caleb's reaction. Caleb didn't react. He didn't move. He just stood there and let the punch drift past, watching Rick with unsettling calm. Rick frowned. He tried again, jab, cross, hook. This time with more speed, more pressure. Caleb slipped the punches without fanfare, leaning barely enough to let each blow miss by inches. His feet didn't move. His hands didn't rise. But Rick's combinations weren't landing, and suddenly, that wasn't funny anymore. The students were quiet now. The gym was silent except for the rhythmic slap of Rick's gloves cutting through air. And even that began to sound hollow. "Move," Rick snapped. block something. But Caleb just stood there, slipping each punch like he'd done it 1,000 times in his sleep. The movements were subtle, efficient, waste-free. Angela stared, stunned. She'd watched hundreds of hours of fight footage for her thesis. No amateur moved like that. No one with zero training avoided punches with that kind of economy. She wasn't the only one who noticed. One by one, students were exchanging looks, frowns of confusion, furrowed brows. The slow realization that something was happening here that none of them understood. Rick launched another combo, uppercut, hook, knee feint, trying to catch Caleb off guard. To make him move, react, show weakness. Caleb shifted just enough. No drama, no noise. Just precision. Rick's knee swung through empty air. He landed awkwardly, stepping back to reset. His chest was heaving now, more from nerves than exertion. Caleb finally took a step forward. Just one. And it was like a boulder rolling downhill. Rick instinctively stepped back. That was the first true mistake. The crowd saw it. A coach, a black belt, backpedaling from a janitor. Caleb tilted his head slightly. Still think this is a good idea? Rick clenched his jaw. You trying to scare me? Caleb said nothing. His silence was the answer. Rick shouted, his voice cracking. Come on then. Throw something. Show us what you got. Caleb didn't move. And that was the problem. He didn't need to. The more Rick moved, the more he exposed. His shoulders were tight, his breath shallow, and his hands, always so steady during sparring, trembled just enough that Caleb noticed. Rick could see it in the way Caleb's gaze followed him, not mocking, not even amused, just calmly registering weakness like a machine logging data. That calm was infuriating. It was disrespectful. It made Rick feel small, like a performer who'd forgotten his lines. You think you're clever, Rick spat, circling again, his voice brittle. You're just standing there, making me look like a fool. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. The stillness was answer enough. Say something, Rick snapped, feinting a jab he had no intention of throwing. Caleb tilted his head slightly, not taking the bait. You're doing fine on your own. The sentence landed harder than any punch, and Rick felt heat flush his face. Somewhere deep in his stomach, anger curled into something heavier, shame. It wasn't just the taunts that were failing now. It was control. The room no longer felt like his domain, his students, his pride. All of it was slipping inch by inch under the pressure of a man who hadn't thrown a single punch. Rick surged forward suddenly, fists flashing in a blur, a real flurry this time, quick, trained, punishing. But Caleb moved like smoke. He didn't block or strike or step far. He bent and twisted just enough, each movement like it had been written before the punches were even thrown. Rick's left cross skimmed empty air. His right hook hit nothing but the cold breeze of the gym's overhead fan. He grunted, spun, tried a sweeping low kick to take the old man's legs out from under him. Caleb lifted his right foot, the movement barely more than a pivot, and Rick's leg swiped through nothing. Off balance, Rick stumbled and caught himself with a quick hop, breath coming fast now, sweat dripping down his forehead, not from exertion, but from something closer to panic. The students saw it. They all saw it. The look on their faces had shifted from admiration to confusion, and now, worst of all, to doubt. Angela's arms were still crossed, but her eyes were wide. A tall, red-headed student whispered something to the guy next to him, both of them nodding slowly. Rick's chest tightened. You think this is a game? He growled. You think you're better than me? Caleb's voice came low, even. I think you're scared. Rick lunged. He didn't think. He just moved. It wasn't a combo, it wasn't technique, it was desperation. And Caleb read it like an open book. One pivot, a slight lean, and Rick was too close, his momentum carrying him past his target. Caleb didn't move to counter. He didn't have to. Rick turned and saw those eyes again, calm and level, and something inside him broke. You son of a, he growled, stepping in with a clumsy overhand right, throwing all his weight behind it. He knew it was a mistake the moment it left his hand, but it was too late. Caleb stepped aside, not much, not dramatically, just a half step with surgical precision, and placed a single open palm against Rick's shoulder. No push, no strike, just pressure. Rick fell, hard, not from the touch, but from his own imbalance. His legs tangled beneath him, and he hit the mat with a loud thud, the slap echoing like a gunshot. Silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. Rick stared at the ceiling, his ears ringing, his heart pounding, his face hot with shame. He rolled onto his side, tried to get up quickly, but even that motion felt clumsy and exposed. Caleb didn't gloat. He didn't posture. He just stepped back, giving space, like he was still waiting for this to be a spar, not a collapse. Rick finally stood, his legs shaky, his breath ragged. "You tripped me," he muttered. "That's all." Caleb said nothing. Rick looked at his students. They weren't laughing. Angela took out her phone, not to record, but to check something. She tapped rapidly, her eyes scanning the screen, then glancing up at Caleb. Rick noticed and felt another wave of unease roll through him. What was she looking for? "This isn't over," Rick said, louder now, forcing strength into his voice. "You're not embarrassing me in my own gym." Caleb finally looked at him, the first time since the fall. "I didn't embarrass you. You did that yourself." Rick charged. No technique, no strategy, just rage. A straight punch meant to shut everyone up. Caleb caught his wrist midair. Not blocked. Caught. And held. Rick froze. His entire body seized, as if electricity had just sparked through his arm. Caleb didn't squeeze. He didn't twist. But Rick couldn't move. His wrist was locked, controlled, with the terrifying calm of someone who'd done this more times than they could count. "Put the phone away," he snapped, though his voice cracked from the strain of humiliation. Angela didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on the screen, lips pressed together in confusion, then shock. She turned the phone outward, showing the first image that appeared on the search result. It wasn't a picture of a janitor or a security guard. It was a photo taken years ago, slightly grainy, showing a younger Caleb, clean-shaven, gloves up, blood trailing from a split lip as he stared down an opponent who looked terrified. Beneath the image was a name that struck like thunder in the silent gym. Caleb Reaper Brooks. Rick's mouth fell slightly open. The title beneath the image read, "Former undefeated MMA world champion, record holder for most consecutive knockouts in pro league history, retired after disappearing from public life nearly 20 years ago." Rick shook his head, stepping toward her. "That's not him. That can't be him." Angela didn't look up. She scrolled down, reading more out loud. "Retired after an in-ring fatality during a private sparring session. Declined all interviews. No public appearances since 2007. Believed to be living off-grid." She looked up at Caleb now. "It is you, isn't it?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. His silence, steady and deliberate, said more than confirmation ever could. The room changed instantly. It was no longer just about a spar gone wrong or a teacher exposed. Now, the students were staring at someone who had once lived at the peak of violence, at the pinnacle of power, and had chosen to vanish rather than bask in it. Rick's chest rose and fell, the shallow panic in his breathing no longer hidden. "You killed someone," he blurted, his voice loud and hollow. Caleb's gaze hardened slightly, not defensive, not ashamed, but like a man bracing against the impact of an old wound being pulled open again. Angela narrowed her eyes at Rick. It was ruled an accident, a freak impact during sparring. The opponent didn't have a mouthguard, wasn't supposed to be in the ring. "Still," Rick said, pointing now, desperate to regain authority, "you hit it. You let us think you were just some hired help. That's deception." "No," Caleb said finally, his voice low, calm, cutting through Rick's bluster like a scalpel. "I let you believe what you wanted to believe. That's not the same." Rick laughed sharply, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're some kind of hero now." Caleb stepped forward once, and Rick instinctively flinched. It wasn't a big movement, just a reflex, but everyone saw it. The students watched as their once confident coach shrank under the gaze of a man they now knew had fought in rings where men didn't play by rules, where reputations were built on broken bones and silent victories. "No," Caleb said, "I don't want to be a hero. I just want to be left alone." "Then why come here?" Rick barked. "Why take a job where you watch fighters train day after day?" "Because I needed to remember who I was," Caleb said. and I needed to see if I could exist without becoming him again. Angela stepped forward, still holding the phone. But you didn't forget. You just buried it. I tried, Caleb admitted. But some parts of you never stay buried. Rick scoffed and turned back to his students, as if trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. You all saw it. He's dangerous. He's hiding in plain sight. For all we know, he's still capable of what? Angela cut in. Of defending himself after being provoked in front of a crowd? Of enduring your humiliation without throwing a punch? Because from what I saw, he exercised more control in 10 minutes than you have in 10 years. The students murmured among themselves now, louder than before. The tide was shifting. Rick sensed it. He raised his hands. I'm your coach. I've trained you. I built this gym. Don't let some old washed-up ghost rewrite what we built. Caleb exhaled slowly. This place was never about building people up. It was about building yourself up through other people, at their expense. Rick spun back toward him. You don't know what it's like to carry the pressure of leading, of maintaining standards. You're right, Caleb said. I don't know what it's like to humiliate people to make myself feel powerful. I knew pressure, but it was real. In the cage, in the silence after a man doesn't get up. That's a kind of pressure you've never felt. And you wouldn't survive it. Rick's lips curled. You talk a lot for someone who won't throw a punch. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. You already lost. Throwing a punch would be merciful. The words echoed. The students didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They simply stood there, absorbing the shift, the breaking of an illusion they'd lived under since their first training session. Angela's arms were crossed. The red-headed guy had shifted his stance, leaning slightly toward Caleb like a soldier unconsciously choosing a new commanding officer. Even the newest trainee, barely 2 weeks into training, seemed to recoil when Rick's eyes passed over him. Something inside Rick began to spiral. He had built this gym from nothing. He had fought for years, trained every day, sacrificed weekends, family time, even relationships, all for the sake of discipline, respect, and strength, or at least that was what he told himself. But now, in this moment, the legacy he believed he had crafted looked more like a house of mirrors than a fortress of character. And the worst part wasn't the humiliation, it wasn't even the fall from grace. It was the terrifying realization that maybe, just maybe, Caleb had been right all along. Still, Rick wasn't ready to surrender. His pride, bruised and fragile as it was, reared up like a dying beast refusing to collapse. He straightened his spine and raised his voice with a desperate bite. All right, he said, arms flaring slightly as if calling attention back to himself. You all want to stand around gawking like sheep? You think this is over? You think one viral clip and a legend from the grave changes anything? His voice cracked on that last word, but he powered through. This gym didn't become one of the best because we cowered behind stories. It became the best because of what I built, brick by brick, body by body. You think one ghost is going to tear that down? Caleb didn't flinch. He hadn't moved in nearly 3 minutes, and yet he felt like the only force in the room. Rick turned his body halfway toward the exit, suddenly pacing, speaking more to himself now than to the crowd. He's not staying. He doesn't belong here. He's not even registered anymore. No certifications, no license, no affiliation with any league. This man is a liability. What happens if he snaps again? What happens if another accident takes place? You're all too young to understand what that kind of darkness does to a person. You admire him because he's quiet, because he doesn't gloat, but I've been around fighters long enough to know. Those are the ones you should fear most. He looked back toward Caleb now, trying to force him into a response. Caleb met his gaze, but there was no spark of retaliation, no anger, no heat. Just cool, emotionless calculation. Rick hated that look. It was like staring into a mirror that showed only your insecurities. Say something, Rick said through gritted teeth. You have everyone convinced. So go ahead. Tell them who you really are. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Rick stepped closer, emboldened by the silence, and his voice dropped an octave. Tell them about the man you killed. Tell them about the blood you left on the mat. tell them why you ran away and started hiding behind mop buckets and security cameras." Angela shifted slightly. "He already did," she said. Rick's head snapped toward her. "What?" "He already told us," she said again. "He didn't lie. You just weren't listening." Rick opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. It was as if every argument he'd rehearsed in his head had just evaporated. Angela turned toward Caleb and added, "You didn't have to punch him, Mr. Brooks. You already won." The room remained deathly quiet. Caleb finally stepped forward, not aggressively, but with purpose. He moved toward Rick slowly, deliberately, until they stood just 2 feet apart. Caleb's voice, when it came, was soft enough that only Rick and a few nearby students could hear it clearly. "You think I came back to fight?" he asked. "I came here to make sure I hadn't forgotten how not to." Rick blinked, unsure what to say, unsure how to respond to something so precise and damning. "You've spent years teaching students how to hit," Caleb continued. "I spent my life learning how not to. That's the difference between us. You train for combat. I train for control." Rick laughed once, short and bitter. "So you're what, a monk now? Some kind of philosopher in gym shoes?" Caleb didn't smile. "I'm a man who's tired of burying the best parts of himself just because people like you are afraid of what they don't understand." Rick's shoulders stiffened. He looked ready to throw another insult, but one of the students stepped forward, Jason, a senior belt who had been with Rick for over 5 years. "Coach," Jason said slowly, "maybe it's time to stop talking." That hit harder than any strike. Rick turned to Jason, searching for some trace of loyalty, but found none. Another student joined him, then another. In moments, half the class was standing closer to Caleb than to Rick. The power shift was complete. The room didn't belong to Rick anymore. Caleb turned away, walking toward the edge of the mat. For a moment, Rick considered charging him again, one last desperate attack to reclaim dignity. But something stopped him. Not fear, not exactly, but the deep, hollow knowing that another failure would end him permanently. Caleb reached the wall, where his jacket still hung on a hook. He picked it up, sliding it on with practiced ease. He could feel their doubt curling in the corners of their stares, like smoke rising after a controlled burn. Jason didn't say anything, but the way he turned away spoke louder than words. Angela tucked her phone into her jacket and crossed her arms, her expression unreadable, but her body language screamed that she no longer recognized the man who had once taught her how to break an arm cleanly. Rick opened his mouth to speak, but stopped himself. What could he say? That they had all misunderstood? That Caleb was dangerous? That this was his gym, and he didn't need some washed-up ghost haunting it? But none of those arguments would land. Not after what they had all seen. Not after the quiet way Caleb had dominated the space just by existing within it. Rick turned away and stormed into his office, slamming the door shut behind him. The click of a lock was louder than it needed to be, but he didn't care. He sat down heavily behind his desk, hands gripping the edge as he stared at the wall, breathing hard through his nose. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum, his ego bleeding out from invisible wounds. For nearly 2 decades, he had shaped this gym into his kingdom, molding fighters, drilling respect, demanding discipline. And then, in a single evening, one man, one ghost from a forgotten chapter, had walked in and exposed everything Rick had built as hollow. Rick leaned back and stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched tight as the sting of sweat mixed with humiliation dripped down his spine. The silence wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Caleb hadn't just embarrassed him in front of his students. He had peeled back a layer of Rick's identity and left him standing there, raw and exposed. The worst part was the restraint. Caleb hadn't needed to retaliate. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or lift his fist. That kind of control, real control, was terrifying because it meant he hadn't come for violence. He had come because something in him still needed to be tested, and Rick had unknowingly volunteered to be that test. And Rick had failed, miserably. But as he sat there, seething in a cocktail of shame and rage, something else began to stir. It wasn't humility. It wasn't clarity. It was darker, older. It was the same part of him that used to flare up in street fights when he was a teenager. The part of him that hated being looked down on. The part of him that thought being feared was the same as being respected. That part wasn't dead. It had just been quiet, buried under years of medals and seminars and promotional videos. But now it was wide awake, angry, and looking for a target. Rick stood up abruptly and paced the office like a caged animal. His fists clenched and unclenched as he replayed every second of the confrontation. He saw the way Caleb had moved, effortless and surgical, like someone who didn't just know how to fight, but who understood violence on a molecular level. That kind of precision didn't come from training videos or weekend sparring. It came from something primal. And Rick realized he hated that more than anything. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was real. Rick's fist struck the edge of the desk, hard enough to rattle the contents and send a pen rolling to the floor. He couldn't let it end like this. He wouldn't. That night, Rick didn't sleep. He stayed at the gym long after the students had left, pacing between the mats, running drills by himself, pushing his body until his muscles screamed. But it wasn't training, it was punishment. Every punch he threw was aimed at the ghost of Caleb Brooks, the image of a man who didn't need anger to command a room. And somewhere between the 100th jab and the 1,000th push-up, Rick started to feel something shift. Not in his body, but in his mind. It was as if a dam had cracked, and something old and buried had started to leak through. A version of himself he thought he had outgrown was whispering again, telling him that maybe the only way to get back what he lost was to abandon everything he thought made him a teacher. Maybe respect was a myth. Maybe fear was enough. The next morning, Rick stood in front of the mirror in the locker room, shirtless, drenched in sweat. He looked different, not physically, but in his eyes. The arrogance was gone, but so was the restraint. In its place was a cold, clinical resolve. He wouldn't beg the students to stay. He wouldn't apologize for losing control. He would remind them who he was. Not the polished instructor they'd come to expect, but the fighter who used to brawl in underground rings across the country. The one who took pride in breaking ribs and leaving scars. In its place was an erratic energy, aggressive, unpredictable, like a pressure cooker without a release valve. And the students felt it. Every jab Rick corrected came with a bite. Every takedown critique was sharp, like a blade buried just beneath the words. Sparring rounds were no longer teaching tools, but tests of survival. Rick didn't care about form anymore. He wanted to see who could endure. By Friday, 2 white belts had already quit, walking off the mat mid-session after being pushed too hard. One had a bloody nose, the other a swollen wrist. Rick hadn't even acknowledged their departure. "Weakness finds the exit before I have to show it the door," he had said flatly, wiping his hands with a towel like their injuries were insignificant. But it was more than just cruelty. It was obsession. After hours, he stayed behind alone, training until the walls echoed with his breathing and the thud of fists against the mat. He ran the same sequences over and over, his movements mechanical, robotic, a man no longer training to teach, but to prove something, to someone, maybe to himself. The change didn't go unnoticed for long. On Monday, Sarah, the gym's co-owner, pulled Rick into the office. She had co-founded the gym with Rick 6 years earlier, trusting his discipline and reputation. But now her expression was tight, unreadable, as she folded her arms across her chest and leaned against the desk. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. Rick didn't sit. He remained standing near the door, shoulders taut, eyes locked onto hers like a predator watching for weakness. "You've been pushing the students too hard," she continued. "We've had complaints, injuries, dropouts. What's going on with you?" Rick's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. The silence stretched. Finally, Sarah sighed and softened her tone. "Look, I get it. What happened last week with Caleb, yeah, it rattled all of us. But we can't run this gym on ego. We built this place on discipline, not dominance." Rick's nostrils flared, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but edged in steel. "You don't understand what that man represents." Sarah blinked. "He walked in and humiliated me," Rick said, his voice rising, "without even touching me. That kind of man is dangerous. He doesn't belong here. And the fact that these kids are flocking to him, like he's some damn prophet, It's pathetic." Sarah stepped forward. "You think that's what this is about? That they're just dazzled? Rick, they respected you before. They admired you. But now you're tearing them down instead of building them up. You're not fighting Caleb anymore, you're fighting ghosts." Rick turned and walked out without another word. That night, the class was brutal. Rick made the students run double drills, 5-minute sparring rounds with no rest, and pushed through techniques with the fervor of a drill sergeant on a warpath. When Angela misstepped during a rear naked choke transition, he called her out in front of everyone. "That's pathetic," he barked. "Do you want to get strangled in a real fight? You're purple belt, not kindergarten." The class froze. Angela's eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Jason moved forward, fists clenching. "Coach, that's enough." Rick spun on him. "You want to defend that garbage? Be my guest. Take her place." Jason nodded slowly and stepped onto the mat. They circled each other, the tension crackling in the air. Rick's movements were tight, aggressive, as he lunged at Jason with a takedown that was just a bit too fast, just a bit too hard. Jason countered, surprised by the ferocity, but managed to roll and recover. Rick didn't stop. He closed in again, fists flying, not with control, but with force. The spar was supposed to be technical, but Rick was fighting like it mattered, like it was personal. Jason barely avoided a knee that came dangerously close to his chin. "Coach, what are you doing?" he asked, breathless. Rick didn't answer. He attacked again. Finally, Sarah stepped in, voice loud and commanding. "Rick, stop. Now." Rick froze, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his temples. The room was silent again. The students weren't just surprised, they were scared. Rick looked around and saw it in their eyes. They didn't trust him anymore. That night, Angela didn't come back. They all pointed to the same painful truth. Caleb Brooks had become the center of attention, the man who exposed Rick's vulnerabilities and changed the gym's dynamics forever. Rick's pride throbbed like a wound, raw and unhealed, but beneath it all simmered a different feeling, a quiet, deadly focus that he hadn't felt in years. He realized he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not when so much was at stake. At home, Rick's apartment was a stark contrast to the chaos inside his head. The minimalist decor, the perfectly arranged shelves, and the framed photos of past victories painted a picture of order and control. But the man who lived there was unraveling. He poured himself a stiff drink, stared out the window at the glowing city lights, and promised himself that this was not the end. He needed a plan, something to reclaim his place, his respect, his identity. And that meant facing Caleb again. Meanwhile, Caleb's own world was shifting as well. After the confrontation at Iron Pulse, he returned to his small apartment on the east side, where the silence was both a comfort and a burden. The walls were lined with faded photos and newspaper clippings chronicling a career that seemed like someone else's life. For years, Caleb had buried that man beneath layers of anonymity and routine. But the events of that night stirred old memories, both the victories and the ghosts. Angela had contacted him the next day. Her voice had been tentative, almost hesitant, but firm. She wanted to help, to document his story, to show the world that strength wasn't just measured in wins or titles, but in restraint and character. Caleb had resisted at first. He wasn't interested in fame or redemption, but something about her persistence, and maybe the hope that his story could change minds, softened his resolve. They met over coffee, talking for hours about the gym, the fighters, the culture that often masked cruelty as discipline. Angela was fascinated by his perspective, but also deeply respectful of his pain. "You didn't have to prove anything," she told him. "You showed them something they desperately needed to see." Caleb nodded. "Maybe. But it's just the beginning." Back at the gym, Sarah was working overtime to repair the damage. She met with the students individually, listened to their fears and frustrations, and tried to rebuild trust in a place fractured by pride and ego. She arranged meetings with former instructors and invited Caleb to come back, but this time not as a competitor or shadowy figure, but as a mentor and philosopher of the martial arts. Rick, however, was preparing for his return with a different kind of fire. He hired a private coach to sharpen his skills, pushing his body harder than ever. He studied Caleb's fighting style, analyzing videos and interviews, searching for weaknesses. But more than that, he trained his mind to harden his heart. He was ready to remind everyone why he was the man they should fear, not the man they should admire. The stage was set for a collision, not just of fists, but of ideals. Caleb represented control, restraint, and the painful wisdom of survival. Rick embodied raw ambition, pride, and the desperate need to reclaim a throne slipping through his fingers. Rick's footsteps echoed through the gym as he entered, every step carrying the weight of his bruised pride and burning ambition. He wore his usual black training gear, but his eyes were colder, sharper, like a predator finally released from its cage. The first thing he did was address the room, his voice steady but laced with steel. "I'm back," he said simply, "and I'm here to finish what I started." No one moved. The students were caught between awe and anxiety, unsure whether to cheer or hold their breath. Caleb stepped forward, his voice calm and deliberate. "This isn't about finishing anything, Rick. It's about understanding what you lost and what you need to find." Rick's gaze flicked to Caleb, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "Spare me the lectures. I'm here to train, to teach, and to remind everyone who the real coach is." Angela, standing near the back with her notebook, exchanged a glance with Jason, who nodded slightly. The class was about to begin, but this was no ordinary session. Rick launched into the warm-up with fierce intensity, pushing students harder than ever before. His drills were sharp, his corrections cutting. But beneath the surface, everyone sensed that Rick was fighting more than just technique. He was fighting demons, his own insecurities, and the shadow of Caleb's quiet dominance. Caleb didn't engage at first. He watched, occasionally stepping onto the mat to demonstrate subtle adjustments or philosophical points. His presence was a counterbalance to Rick's aggression, a reminder that martial arts was as much about control as it was about power. The tension between the two men simmered beneath every exchange. Finally, near the end of the session, Rick called out, "Caleb, step up." The gym fell silent. Caleb nodded and moved to the center of the mat. Rick squared up, fists raised, eyes locked on his old rival. "Let's see what you've got." The first clash was a flurry of blows, neither man holding back. Rick attacked with the fiery passion of a man desperate to prove himself. Caleb moved with precision and grace, deflecting, slipping, and countering without aggression. The students watched spellbound as the two men danced, a brutal ballet of power and control. Rick's frustration grew as his strikes failed to land solidly. He forced his body harder, throwing combinations with reckless abandon. Caleb remained composed, using every opportunity to teach, to redirect energy rather than fight it head-on. At one point, Caleb caught Rick's wrist mid-punch and gently but firmly twisted, bringing him down in a controlled sweep. Rick hit the mat hard but quickly rolled away, springing to his feet with a fierce glare. "You're holding back," Rick growled. "You don't want this." Caleb shook his head slowly. "I want this to end with respect." Rick snarled and charged again, but this time Caleb used his momentum to throw him off balance, a perfect counter that sent Rick sprawling. For a moment, the gym held its breath. Rick lay on the mat, chest heaving, eyes fierce but thoughtful. He looked up at Caleb and then at the assembled students. Slowly, he nodded. "You win." Caleb extended a hand. Rick hesitated, then clasped it firmly. The gym erupted, not in cheers, but in a quiet, respectful applause that spoke volumes. That night wasn't just a fight. It was a reckoning. The sun had just begun its slow descent, casting long amber shadows across the Iron Pulse MMA gym, illuminating dust motes dancing in the fading light. Inside, the atmosphere was unlike anything the space had known before, calm yet charged, filled with a quiet energy born from lessons far beyond punches and kicks. Caleb Brooks stood by the edge of the mat, his gaze sweeping over the students gathered for a special session. They weren't just fighters anymore. They were seekers, apprentices in a craft that transcended physicality. Angela sat nearby, her notebook closed, her eyes bright with hope. Jason, now a confident black belt, adjusted his GI, waiting for the class to begin. Rick Landon, once the fiery coach, consumed by pride and desperation, had transformed. He no longer barked orders or pushed students to breaking points. Instead, he moved with measured intent, his voice calm but authoritative, guiding rather than commanding. When Caleb stepped forward to speak, the room hushed instantly. Martial arts, he began, is not about proving you're better than the person across from you. It's not about domination or ego. It's about respect for yourself, for your opponent, and for the art itself. He paused, allowing the words to settle. True strength lies in control, in the patience to know when to strike and when to hold back. It's in the humility to admit what you don't know and the courage to learn. The students listened intently, some nodding, others absorbing the gravity of the message. Caleb's voice was steady, each syllable deliberate. I spent years running from who I was, afraid that the power I carried would only bring pain. But I learned that strength without responsibility is empty. It's a storm that destroys everything in its path, including yourself. Rick stepped beside Caleb, his eyes meeting the same crowd. I fought hard to build respect, he said quietly. But I learned the hard way that respect isn't something you demand with fists or words. It's earned through character, through how you treat others when no one is watching. Angela smiled softly, feeling the weight of transformation in the room. She raised her hand and asked, "What do you say to those who see martial arts as just fighting, not philosophy?" Caleb replied, "I say they haven't yet met the true warrior." A murmur of agreement spread. Rick added, "And they haven't yet seen that the greatest victories are the ones won within." The session continued with technical drills interwoven with stories, philosophy, and moments of reflection. Caleb and Rick shared the stage as equals, their past rivalry now a bridge connecting generations. The gym had become more than a training ground. It was a community, a place where strength and compassion coexisted. Weeks later, a video of that session went viral. Not because of spectacular knockouts or flashy moves, but because of the message Caleb and Rick delivered together. That strength is not measured by power alone, but by respect, humility, and integrity. Outside the gym, the story inspired countless others, fighters, coaches, and everyday people struggling with their own battles. Caleb returned to his quiet life, but now with a purpose renewed. He knew the scars of the past would always remain, but so would the lessons learned in that gym. Rick, once consumed by pride, found peace in mentorship and growth. And the students? They carried forward a new understanding that in martial arts, as in life, the greatest mastery is over oneself. As the gym lights dimmed for the night, Caleb looked around at the empty mats, the echoes of laughter and training still lingering. He smiled faintly. In the end, it wasn't about who could hit harder or last longer. It was about the journey of humility, redemption, and respect that made all the difference. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful tales like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the plot resonated with you the most? And where are you watching from? Drop a comment below to join the conversation and connect with others who appreciate stories about strength, respect, and redemption. Your support means a lot and helps us bring more inspiring content your way.